Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is that rather strange show with that rather strange presenter looking at rather strange music, right? Well, most of the time anyway. Since starting the show, we've been getting a lot of, suggestions for various things we could be covering on this channel, which, it kind of blows me away, to be honest. And of course, I'm unsure if I'm ever going to get around to absolutely everything, but of course I will generally try my best, On that subject today, though, today's episode comes from a request from Miska Lamberg, who suggested the works of Jeph Jerman for inclusion on the show. And so what I found interesting, actually, about Miska's suggestion here was I ended up discovering that I already had an album by Jeph Jerman in my Bandcamp collection from back when I purchased the entirety of Fault's Records discography for just €1, which I believe you can still do, by the way. So although I was thinking of diving into that particular album, I found myself stuck on exactly what to say, and as a result I ended up just exploring other albums by Jeph Jerman, and this is the one I've landed on. This is the one that all thoughts came out for, so this is what we're presenting today. Today I present to you Greyware by Jeph Jerman. So, before we dive into this incredible world of grey, let's ask ourselves, who is Jeph Jerman? Well, Jeph Jerman is an experimental composer whose work dives into field recordings and experimentalism. And born in Agana in 1959, Jerman is somewhat of a veteran of the experimental scene, having released, an incredible number of, experimental albums over his very long career, both under his name, under various aliases, within different groups, and of course, through countless collaborations between a wide range of different artists, including one Greg Davis, who's released some of my favourite drone records. We might cover some of his work late in another episode one day. And as well, though, a stalwart of the lowercase scene, one Bernard Gunter. And across this fascinating body of work, Jerman has delved deep into the world of found sounds, providing album after album that just places you in the most peculiar and unusual of landscapes. And so, what is Greyware? Well, simply put, it's a 40-minute album released on Mormar's label based in Greece, comprised of two 20-minute tracks, offering that quintessential German style of manipulated field recordings. And so, in my discovery of the vast discography of Jeph Jerman, I find most of his albums all tend to follow this, this rather particular style of experimentalism, where you have these field recordings, being meshed together in such weird and unusual ways that create these incredible soundscapes that are constantly shifting and changing, but they never once really reveal any discernible details that tell us exactly what it is we are hearing. It all creates this rather confusing but oddly engrossing listening experience that pulls us into these strange soundscapes, where we're left trying to interpret and understand the particulars of the sounds, as it ends up being naturally interpreted by our heads, as we find ourselves wandering those strange and unusual worlds. And to be perfectly honest, I just find it so interesting, as I love exploring unusual soundscapes, but describing it in words I find genuinely difficult with Jerman's music. I don't know, it just really baffles me, but we'll try our best. And so, the first track, A-side, immediately opens up with this incredibly hollow-sounding drone that simply sounds like an expression of the everyday world all around us on a day-to-day basis. It's like standing in the middle of a platform, or in the middle of a warehouse, or in the middle of an empty street, or in the middle of an alleyway, just somewhere, And you're given this very peculiar sound source as the whole composition just starts coming together in very unusual and subtle ways. You can hear the echoes of some kind of apparatus being moved around, the drips of some leaky water source landing in a puddle and ringing out with that unusual echo. And the more it progresses, though, the harder it becomes to actually interpret, as we end up with these squeaky, rubbery sounds that further dives into the howling wind tunnels and the constant scraping and scratching in the background of something. It's around 14 minutes into this particular track, though, you kind of get a change from that hollow-sounding wind tunnel thing, as we're then confronted with such an unusual cluster of micro sounds that push right up against your very ears, accompanied by, still, the very gentle tapping and echoing of just something, What I find so interesting about this one, though, is how the more it progresses, the more presence that certain sound sources end up having, as the album's progressing. They become the very characters that are part of the very narrative of this sound performance. And it culminates into this, this very unusual experience as you try to interpret and process and also form some understanding of it, with the only basis being the very listening experience itself, though. And for some reason, my brain interprets this whole thing as some kind of building just taking us, from through its many different rooms it has. The insides of these very walls expressing themselves in such weird and unusual ways as the pipes and the boards just creak and rattle along. And it's such an odd soundscape indeed, but it's very interesting how it just draws you in and pushes you along that ride for the entire duration. And so, flip over the cassette. We throw ourselves into the soundscape of side B, of course. This lasts the exact same length as its predecessor, and it offers us a very similar kind of experience to that previous track, though this one I feel is rather different and in the kind of weird and unusual soundscape that we're actually inhabiting on this one. It's this one opens up with this very peculiar and dominating force of bended sounds, distress signals, crying out from some faulty piece of machinery, a constant rumbling and crackling of micro sounds. It's all incredibly peculiar and unusual, and although with this one you kind of have the appearance of some voices, scattered very sporadically throughout the entirety of the previous track. It feels like the ones we have here, though, are being pulled through the actual mixer into the netherworld, where it just fails to sound like anything truly tangible within our reality, if that makes sense. You end up with some very, very weird soundscapes that just progress along with this static noise and very nicely mixed high-pitched frequencies that hover above the entire recording as well. But it's genuinely so difficult to place it within anything tangible, though. But I feel like that's the very point of Jerman's compositions, though. They take all these disparate sound sources and construct them into this wholly unique album experience, whichever one you decide to listen to. And as it's all progressing along, though, it's constantly shifting and changing as new sounds just enter the mix and old ones just fade back away, turning into this ever-changing experience that keeps trying its best to recall some kind of memory from us as listeners. And so, I find experimental music like this, incredibly interesting. And it is very hard to put it into words, but the very experience of listening to stuff like this, I've always found incredibly interesting, and it's always really unique on some kind of level. And since discovering the very eclectic world of Jeph Jerman, I really enjoy how all of his soundscapes across his entire body of work end up being rather baffling and confusing, yet very engrossing experiences to just undergo. And the actual act of listening to these very recordings, they place it into very different settings, each one that's much more strange and unusual than the last. And yet, there's always some kind of level of reality to it, if that makes sense. So, like for this one, I was just constantly imagining, just the warehouses and just grey buildings and stuff like that. Yeah, at the beginning I mentioned Fault Records, that I'd already owned a Jeph Jerman album as well, so I'll use this one as an example, the album Winterist. And although I was going to write about it, I wasn't able to just get a whole script worth of stuff about it. But I remember when I first heard it, it was placing me into this incredibly, surreal version of some kind of log cabin by the waterfront, that housed a rowboat of sorts that's, there to just go off fishing into the icy cold lake beyond. No, that's the image that conjured up into my head when listening to Winterist, and I feel like, with any Jeph Jerman album, you're going to get placed into some sort of strange location, if that makes sense. And so Greyware feels like standing amongst, just these empty warehouses, located, far away in the large looming industrial factories that now occupies the skyline as people just file in and out of their droves, It's so unusual, but I just find it so interesting and oddly existential, actually, on some level, though, because it's like placing you into this sort of weird alternate reality, if that makes sense. Like, especially when you're just engrossed by the recordings, though. Very hard to explain, though. And so, yeah, I think with that, we might as well be coming to the end of today's episode of Weird Music, This was a very strange album to dive into, no doubt, but I did want to talk about Jerman on the channel in some way, shape, or form, And to be fair, I'm very surprised that Greyware ended up being the very album I wanted to talk about. When I listened to it, it was just putting me into such this cold, surreal landscape, consistently pushing out this unusual soundscape that pushed further and further into the strange world it was expressing. And I feel like Jerman's approach to everything too, just going out there, exploring the world of sound and presenting it back to us in these rather strange and esoteric ways, rather much like Luke Ferrari, I would say. Though I feel like Jeph Jerman just, really compiles it into these incredibly surreal, just experiences, if that makes sense. But yeah, in any case, if you're watching this, if you're still watching at this point and you know of Jeph Jerman, then by all means, let me know what your favourite release of his is in the very comments below. I would love to know and check out more albums by Jeph, especially the ones that you have been enjoying. But with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye!